Hello, everyone. It's good to see you again. This video is in response to those of you who missed the Zoom meeting. So, if you missed the Zoom meeting, here is the recording or the presentation for that. This week we've been talking about the conquest of the Americas or the discovery of the New World. Of course, you have to talk first about Christopher Columbus and his rediscovery of the New World. He didn't exactly discover the New World. He thought he did, but we have later found out that he had information from Norse traders of a new world to the east. However, he thought it was just a couple of islands way up north by Greenland. He didn't realize that there was a whole huge continent between him and China or India, which he was trying to find between a new route in order to bypass the Ottoman Empire, who controlled the trade routes in Europe. Um, so he used this information. He thought that the ocean was only going to be maybe 1,000 miles across. He didn't realize that it would be a 6,000 mile difference. Um, so he started to sail off across the Atlantic. And when he came to the Caribbeans, he called it the West Indies because he thought he had found India, when in fact he actually found a new group of people, new islands. Um, he only explored right around here in this area. Um, let's go back to that. So he only found in this area right here. Um, and so, yeah, he wasn't a very nice guy. He came into these populations, stripped the indigenous we call them Native Americans today, but he called them Indians because he thought they were from India. But he enslaved the native populations, forced them to work to find gold, plant crops, those kind of things. However, due to his treatment of the people, uh, whenever he came back, he was ridiculed and he was penniless and died pretty much unknown until this gentleman, Amerigo Vespucci, kind of rediscovered about 10 years later after the death of Columbus. Um, he found the information of Columbus, I, and he went and took a couple more voyages, and he was able to come in the same route Columbus did, and he actually followed the entire Gulf Coast, Caribbean Sea area, and the East Coast region. He also came back a second time and went south and discovered most of the east coast of South America. After that, they named the names in the two regions, North and South America, after Amerigo Vespucci. That is the reason why we are called Americans and not Colombians. Now, after this rediscovery of this huge continent, they needed to explore it. So um, the Spanish sent a group of people. They sent two of them, called the Conquistadors, and the first one they sent out was Hernando Cortez. His job was to be in search of God, glory, and gold. So he first landed in Mexico region of the Yucatan Peninsula, and he uh, saw that the Aztecs were a huge population of about 20 million people, and he came in and within a year of meeting them, completely defeated them and took over their populations and made what was called New Spain. The reason why he did this with like maybe 800 men versus these millions, and the reason being is because they had black powder. Um, the uh, the conquistadors wore metal armor. As you can see in the pictures above, they had steel weapons. They had gunpowder, which we had gotten from the Chinese about 300 years before this. And it just started to become in popular use. So they had cannons. The Spanish also had horses. The Native Americans did not have horses at all. Matter of fact, we'll talk about that actually here in a second. And they were facing against a group called the Aztecs, and you can see here the Aztec warriors. They wore animal skins. They may have had some metal weapons, some metal spear tips, but it was mostly inferior metals such as copper or bronze, which bend after a time period, unlike steel. And their swords, as you can see here, you see this guy with this wooden club basically, and their swords were made of wood, and they would take igneous rock, that really black, sharp rock uh, that's almost like glass, and they would actually chip it and then embed it in the side of their this board, making a sword. Now you can imagine that hitting the armor of a conquistador and it basically just shattering. Their weapons couldn't penetrate the armor of the conquistadors hardly at all. Um, there's a report that during one battle, Cortez and his 800 men fought against an army of about 30,000 Aztecs, and they only lost like 3 men. Um, and that was just because of random spears finding that rare point in the armor. Um, oh, and one of the guys, I do remember his gun blew up. So, um, yeah, this guy down here, Francisco Pizarro, he would go and face against the Incan Empire in South America. He completely defeated them in 6 months. Um, and it was simply because they were just as well armed as the Aztecs. They had bronze weapons, as you can see here. They wore reed armor that was woven out of reeds, uh, almost like baskets, almost. Um, they wore cloth armor, and he was able to just go in and devastate them. One of the things that also made uh, Pizarro uh, easy to defeat the Aztecs at this time period was because when Cortez first came in and invaded about 10 years before, um, he brought along diseases, and he would use what's called pox blankets, and he gave them to the Aztecs. Um, as gifts, and these it had a disease on it called smallpox, which the Native American populations had never had any contact with this, so they had no immunities, and it completely devastated the population of the Aztecs. And well, because of trade routes and stuff between the Incans and the Aztecs, the smallpox, by the time Pizarro got there, smallpox had already devastated the population of the Incans, weakening them. The Incans were in the middle of a civil war because their leader before um, their last leader, he had died due to smallpox. Here's the area of the conquest of the New Americas. You can see here that Cortez in 1521 first attacked here, and by 1540, Pizarro had completely taken this entire area here. It shows that it took several years for him to get here, but really the Incans were subdued within 6 months. Once he landed here in Lima and Cusco, it was over for the Incan Empire. Um, but yeah, you can see here the conquest of Hispaniola, which is the colony that Columbus made. So within you have 1492 to what's the latest date here? Um, of the Spanish one, I count this British one right here, the French one right here, or the British one here. So 1492 to 1607. So roughly 130 years, 140 years, the Spanish had conquered most of the largest populations of both North and South America. And they were looking for gold. They also looked to convert the Native Americans into Catholicism. because the Catholics wanted the numbers in order to fight the Protestants in England. They wanted to make this a Catholic stronghold before the Protestants ever got over here. Um, and of course, the people who leading these armies wanted the glory of being known in history. These were not nice men. They brutalized the population. Um, the diseases that they brought, and we'll talk about that here, in the Columbian, what's called the Columbian Exchange. And this is where you have that exchange of ideas, goods, and diseases between the two groups. So when the Europeans came over, they first brought over bananas. We think of bananas being from the Caribbean down here in South America, but really, honestly, bananas started out in uh, parts of Africa and the Middle East, and we brought them over to be planted here because of the similar climates. Cattle, there were not the only form of cattle that was in Native America was the buffalo. Chickens, they didn't have chickens. We think of Florida being the orange state, but really, oranges came from parts of Africa and India. We think of Colombia down here being, we think of Colombian coffee. Okay, coffee beans actually came from Ethiopia. Ethiopia um, was is well known for their coffee, especially in Europe and in Asia, which Ethiopia is right here just below Egypt. Um, but they brought the beans over here to Colombia because it was such a great place to grow it. And so Colombia became known for their coffee beans. Um, Onions, peaches, hogs. Hogs, today we have, especially in the South, down through here, we have a huge problem with hogs. Well, pigs were not natural to North America. We brought those over. And of course, sugarcane. Sugarcane came from Asia and India, or from China and in India, and we brought it over here because of the similar climates. And so a lot of the world's largest sugar plantation comes now from the Caribbean. Um, we brought diseases such as measles, smallpox, which we just talked about, mumps, typhus, whooping cough. Those diseases, because of the trade networks between the Aztecs were a very large empire. They had a network of trade that went all the way up even into Missouri. We have found in Missouri Aztec items that have been traded to what was called a group called the Mississippians up here. The Mississippians were thought to have a population of well over 10 million people. If you go to St. Louis, uh, the Boot Hills, you will see these large pyramid shaped hills, and those pyramids were from a group called the Mississippians, and they were a very large population. Europeans have never seen the Mississippians at all, period. And the reason for that is because when the Europeans came over, they brought the diseases. Well, those diseases killed off 95 to 99% of the Native American populations within 100 years. It was one of the largest global pandemics ever. Um, it's, it could be as low as 10 million people possibly died, or some scientists and historians believe well over 100 million deaths within like a one year, possibly a 10-year span, and it's just crazy. Um, Many of you know the story of the Pilgrims when they came over to the New World. They talked about they came over, and if it wasn't for the help of a Native American called Squanto, uh, they wouldn't have survived. Well, Squanto was a Native American who his entire tribe died due to diseases, and uh, and he was the sole survivor, and it was because he, uh, yeah, and so his entire people were killed off, and so Squanto was able to help the Native Americans, but his backstory wasn't there. Now that group, such as the Mississippians, uh, the Europeans never saw them because they were long dead due to the diseases before the Europeans ever explored their area. Um, the Mayans down here in the Yucatan Peninsula. Cortez, whenever he invaded, knew they were there. He had seen some contact with them. But after 2 years of the conquest of the Aztecs, he was going to go and invade the Yucatan. By the time he got there, there were maybe less than 100 survivors. So it made his conquest of that area very, very easy. People died off so fast that the whole histories of people were completely lost. When the Europeans finally came and settled on the East Coast down through here, the European or the Native American populations in North America were just starting to recover. Um, the diseases killed off so many people so quickly that it is thought that the rotting bodies and the uh, lack of CO2 emissions from them may have caused what was called the Little Ice Age during the 1700s, because of the gases and stuff that got up into the air and the atmosphere. And it caused a global cooling worldwide for about 10 years. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was a book uh, written during what was called the year without a summer, and in her diaries she talks about it snowing in southern England. She talks about it snowing 6 inches on the ground in the middle of July. So um, that may have been caused because of the depletion of population of the world, and so the reason why there were so many animals and so many um, abundance of wildlife in this area by the time the Europeans came through was because the populations of North America and especially South America were so badly depleted. We did get some really cool things from the South America or from the New World. We got green beans, all types of beans actually. Pinto, gross. I don't like beans except for green beans, and soybeans. I like soybeans, but we got those. We got cacao, which is chocolate. Uh, we wouldn't have uh, we wouldn't have chocolate today if it wasn't for the New World. Of course, we wouldn't have peanut butter because peanut butter or peanuts were from the New World. Pineapples, potatoes. Um, we when we think of potatoes, we think of Ireland, but really the potatoes came from South America and the Incans, and then were brought over to be cultivated in Europe. Pumpkins, squash, sweet potatoes, tobacco. Tobacco was a plant that was grown in and around the New World. Tomatoes for a long time were considered poisonous, and we wouldn't eat them. It wasn't until the late 1800s that people started to eat the tomato again, and that's because the Europeans ate on a lead-lined plate, and the acid from it would sit on the plate and leach that lead out. Well, after somebody would eat a tomato on a lead-lined plate, um, they the lead would give them lead poisoning, and the person would go crazy. And so therefore they thought the tomato was because it looks similar to the black lotus. Uh, I think it's black lotus. I may be wrong, but it was very similar to other poisonous plants in the shape of their leaves. They thought tomatoes were poisonous. The turkey, they did not have turkeys in Europe. So if you see paintings and stuff during the Renaissance of somebody having a big bird on their table with the legs poking up, that's not a turkey, that's a goose. Turkeys were here, and the reason why we call them turkeys is because of the Ottoman Turks right here. They wore red hats and red scarves, and well, the turkey has that red plume on the top, and their wattle down here uh, is also red. So the New World people, as a way to make fun of the Turkish people, called them turkeys. The second thing that the Europeans brought over, of course, was slave trade. The Aztecs did do slavery, um, but really they were the only group who did it. Uh, but the Europeans really started it. And they started what was called the Atlantic slave trade or the Triangle trade. Slavery in Europe and Africa had been around for several thousand years. As long as our history goes back, we talk about slavery. If you talk about Egypt, we have the story of the Exodus, where the Hebrews were considered in bondage. The Islamic world during this time period, one of their largest trades, of course, was slavery. Um, the Europeans had peasants and serfdom, which was a form of slavery. And then after feudalism would fall, they had a form of slavery called indentured servants, which meant that you owed money to somebody and therefore you would work for them. Well, let's say you owed, let's say I was working for you and I owed you $100, and you could say that um, I only made a penny a week based upon the work I did, and so therefore, you know, it'd take me a really long time to get out of servitude to you, and in order to pay off my debt. Sometimes those debts would be passed down to children. So if a father was an indigent servant and he died, his wife would either have to take it over or his children would take it over. It wasn't cool. But the Atlantic slave trade really brought slavery to a global market. You had one of the first global trades, and that was slavery. It's also called the triangular trade. And the reason why they call it the triangular trade is because it was trade between England and Africa, Africa to the Americas, the New World, and then the Americas back to Africa. Um, Raw materials would be taken out of the New World, such as sugar, cotton, rice, wood, furs, all those natural resources before they were turned into anything, would they be shipped to Europe, where in Europe they would be turned into manufactured goods such as cloth that can be worn, guns, um, wooden items such as cabinets, shelves, clocks, wood ships, those type of things. All the manufactured goods would go to Europe and be made. And then those goods would be either sold and traded back to the colonies or to Africa. Remember when we talked about Mansa Musa, possibly the richest person in the world? The people of Mali was one of the richest civilizations ever known to man. They literally did have cities of gold, and the colonists wanted that from the Africans. So they would sell goods, mostly alcohols, cloth, and gunpowder. And they would sell it at a really, really high price to the Africans. The Africans would give them gold. That gold would then, of course, go back to Spain and Portugal and England. Um, but eventually they started to run out of gold. So the Spanish said, well, hey, we need people in the New World because um, the indigenous population are dying to diseases, and due to their weakened immunities, they don't make a really good workforce. So they started taking African Americans, or not Africans, they started taking Africans out of Africa as slaves, capturing them, trading them, and sending them to the New World for in order to work the plantations to make their new goods because the indigenous population died out. So groups right down through here in Africa. Um, they here, let me see here. Yeah, right here. Oh, whoa, go back to here. No, okay. But anyways, groups like right in through here, uh, they had what was called factories, and those factories were to process slaves, and millions of slaves, something like 200 million slaves came out of Africa from the time the Atlantic slave trade began to the end of slavery in the United States with the end of the Civil War. Slavery uh, was a really bad thing. A lot of people um, were traded. Slaves were mostly sent to the Caribbeans right through here, and right in here into South America in order to work on those sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, chocolate plantations, coffee plantations. Um, those raw materials then would be sold to the colonists. The colonists would um, turn some of those goods into like rum and other things like that. Molasses would, but a lot of that raw material would then leave the colonist once again and go here. Slavery in the South right here didn't really pick up until cotton was starting to become uh, king, as they say, and they started to make cloth out of cotton, and so they put it down here in the Southern Americas because cotton grew really well down in the South, and so they brought in slaves to work that area. Something like 10 million slaves came to the United States, while the majority of the slaves went to South America and the Caribbean. Now, these slaves, you would think, well, wouldn't they just need to be able to get the slaves in and work, and eventually, you know, they wouldn't need to bring any more slaves? Well, the problem with this area down in here is there's a lot of diseases due to the climate. So diseases like malaria, typhoid, yellow fever, a couple of other things, really killed off the populations of Africans even still. So they had to continuously bring in so many slaves. So many slaves were taken out of Africa that entire gene pools were depleted. And so they had a hard time in this area of finding new genetic material for males. And so the population of Africa really started to plummet. And here, entire governments would be destroyed by the Europeans in order to take the slave population out. Once the population of Africa was depleted, the Europeans started to move in and colonize Africa, and started to do what they did over here in North America. When the colonists in other regions over here started to fight back and gain their independence, the European population turned to Africa and started to colonize Africa. And then you had what was called the Scramble for Africa. Africa would be stripped of all of its natural resources. So all that gold and stuff that Mali had was completely devastated and sent to Europe. Natural resources. And now, even into the 20th and 21st centuries, Africa is considered a third world country because of the European involvement in the colonization here, stripping them of all their natural resources. So they didn't have any way of making money in order to improve their lives. Um, Now we're going to talk about colonization, especially in the New World up here in the United States. Colonies started to form because of those wars in the Catholic between the Catholics and the Protestants. So those religious persecutions, those religious wars, drove a lot of people out of Africa, and they sought to settle in the New World. Um, and that's the reason why in our Constitution we have freedom of speech, because the people who came here, I'm sorry, freedom of religion, also freedom of speech, and freedom of press. All these things the people were tired of being persecuted for. So when they formed the new governments of the United States, they made sure that those things were the founding principles of our freedoms. And it was due to because of all these different groups seeking to flee away from the persecution that was happening in their own countries. So you had like German Protestants, Dutch, uh, Irish, um, Puritans, even some Catholics, uh, depending on where they were from. If you're a Catholic in Germany, in northern Germany, which was mostly Protestant, you probably left and came to the United States. Um, so a lot of these groups would come and settle and make new areas for themselves, and those would later become our states, our governments, our religion. So um, that'll end it today. Your assignment is to uh, I want you to make uh, a map of the triangular trade. So you can do it on Google Drawing, you can do it on a Google Slide, but you need to find a blank map of the world. Okay, it's kind of like if you went here. I hope you can see this. If you went here and you type in blank map of world. Okay. You go here and you can copy that map, and then I want you to redraw the triangular trade. You can use symbols, words, whatever you want, but you need to make the arrows showing what goods went to Africa, what goods went to the New World, and what goods came from the New World to Europe. Okay. Once you are done with that, please email it to me. Thank you. Bye. Hope you guys have a good day. Please wash your hands. Please be